This video does not exist to condone the use of any legal or illegal psychoactive substances. It's up to you to do your research before doing any substance, be it legal, illegal, or even prescription. And I really hope that this video actually drives home that point more than anything, because I'm going to talk about something that, well, it's taken me a while to actually get to this video. That being said, this video doesn't exist to completely, denigrate the use of any legal or illegal psychoactive substances either. There's a lot of negative stigma around the use of psychoactive substances, and I feel like if you are well informed and you go into the experience with some degree of caution and research, and you know what you're doing, then it can be rewarding depending on the substance, but I don't condone it, nor do I dissuade it. So, almost 2 years ago, I recorded a video called Psilocybin with Dyspraxia, which basically outlined my first ever psychoactive mushroom trip, which is something that to date is one of the most positive and transformative experiences with any substance I've ever had in my life. And I used to be a stoner that smoked weed all the time. In that video, I also did note how goddamn terrifying that experience was, and it was very, very intense. Now, granted, I did take a much higher dose than I probably should have for what was essentially my first real trip. I mean, like I said in that video, I did take a microdose, if you will, before that in order to kind of prepare myself for it, but then I just dove straight in with what was essentially the rest of what I had in mushrooms. And it was a very intense experience, but it was so transformative and I learned so much from it. And there was a sizable amount of euphoria and enjoyment, especially towards the tail end of the mushroom trip. And so from that point on, although I swore I would never do it again, it was something that left such a positive, lasting impression that a couple of months later, I thought, yeah, you know what? I kind of do want to try that again sometime. But unfortunately, it doesn't matter where you're coming from. Mushrooms are a seasonal crop. And therefore, even with the most diehard of drug dealers in legal and illegal markets, mushrooms are kind of a seasonal crop that aren't easy to get a hold of. So when it came time to do mushrooms again, or what I thought was a good time to do mushrooms again, I had been working a lot and going through a very tough period of my life. Now, many of you may have noticed that I am kind of living in, making videos in the area in which I did when I first made this channel, but in between those two times, I was doing videos from what was essentially a single room in an apartment. And I was living with some passive aggressive individuals, and it was a very uncomfortable, unpleasant environment to be in. And it didn't start out that way because, I mean, as you guys could tell from that video, I did mushrooms just fine there and a very big dose there. And it was still, while intense, quite an enjoyable experience. But as time went on, things kind of got toxic where I was living at the time as well, and work was starting to pile up onto me. So it was a very stressful time, but the guy I was getting my weed from at the time just so happened to get mushrooms and offered them to me. And having had this joyous, magical experience, I thought, okay, yeah, I'll get some mushrooms, and then the next time I have a decent amount of time off, I'll do another trip. So, roughly 6 months after my first super intense, I'll never do that again mushroom trip, I got psilocybe cubensis, which are the classical mushrooms. These mushrooms are known as golden teachers, and they tend to be somewhat more intense compared to the ones that I had before. The ones that I had before were psilocybe mexicana, which tend to be lighter mushrooms. Um, and the thing is, when it comes to psilocybin and other mushrooms, um, you got varying dosages, and you can't really tell from dose to dose or even strain to strain. But in general, cubensis seems to be, the golden standard for mushrooms. And the Mexicanas that I had consumed 6 months prior, while still giving me an intense experience, a large reason why I had an intense experience was because I took so many of them. So this happened roughly almost 2 years ago now, which is absurd to think about. But this is the whole reason I wanted to do this video and why this video took so long. Is you guys may have noticed that a lot of my videos recently not only have been far and far apart, but also have been a lot more weird, existentialist, and trippy than my usual videos. And a large reason for that is because this trip that I went on was so intense, it was borderline traumatizing, and I actually had certain levels of PTSD following the trip. And so that's why it took me so long to do this video. But I really wanted to make this video and kind of outline my experience. And now it's been almost 2 years, and I think I have enough time to have looked back and processed this experience and understood at least some of what I was presented with in it. Um, but the thing is, it was a very, very negative experience. And I don't want anyone to take this as mushrooms are a bad drug that you shouldn't do. In fact, quite the opposite. Psilocybin is one of the safest substances to do when it comes to drugs, at least on a physical level. Now, granted, if you have a family history of something like psychosis or schizophrenia, or you are prone to mental breaks, that's something you shouldn't be doing, and that's to include even things like weed or LSD as well. Any sort of hallucinogenic or mildly hallucinogenic substance is something you should avoid if you are prone to mental breaks and stuff like that. But seeing as how I didn't really have a whole history of schizophrenia or anything, I thought I would just go straight in and have another trip, and yeah, it really wasn't all that good. So, by the time I went to do these mushrooms, I was actually getting ready to escape from the place I was living at the time. The person I was renting the room from was very domineering and incredibly passive aggressive, and so you never knew if they were going to talk shit on you or not. And sometimes you would walk in and just catch them as they were talking shit, but you didn't know if it was you. But every time you would talk to them, they would always have shit to talk about the person who was even maybe living right next to you, or you know what I mean. It was crazy. See, you always had this thought in the back of your mind, like, oh, I wonder what they're thinking, and that breeds a lot of anxiety in general. And it wasn't always like this. I need to mention it didn't start out like this, and this is why I was trying to. I kind of saw the writing on the wall and had to escape back home. So I was in the process of this, getting all my stuff together, getting ready to move back home in the beginning of the year, or in the beginning of the next year. This was in December too. So as you all know, if you've followed this channel for a while, working retail during the holidays doesn't help my mental state at all, and has even affected this channel in multiple points. So overall, I was breaking the cardinal rule of doing any psychoactive substance, but especially psychedelics, which is set and setting. Actually being in the right mindset, in a stable place where you feel comfortable to do a psychoactive substance. So already going into this experience, I should have probably backed out. And I was getting hesitancy to begin with, but I was given 3 days off, which was rare at the time, and I figured it was like a little mini vacation, so I thought, well, as good a time as any to finally use these mushrooms I had sitting around for like a month or two by that point. And, at the time, it didn't seem like that bad of an idea, because it seemed like there was no one else home. But literally, as soon as I went to go pull the bag out, the person I was renting the room from came in, and not only were her young kids in the next room, 10 and 14, I believe they were, at the time at least. But her grandkids were also in the next room. So there was a lot of noise going around in the next room too. They were all downstairs. So it was a lot of people and a lot of stimulus around, which, already was a big red flag and a reason I probably shouldn't have went forward. But I did anyway. And I really feel the need to detail this because, like I said, psilocybin hasn't been bad to me, the substance itself. It was the context in which I used it. And I feel like when it comes to drug use in general, using any drug, it really all comes down to the environment you're in and the reason as which you're using it. For instance, if you were to take something like morphine in the hospital or in a medical clinical environment, morphine is incredible and does great things. But once you're out on your own, if you're taking it every day, or if you're addicted to something like heroin, morphine can be a bad drug. And it's the same thing with psilocybin, not in the same respect as morphine with the addiction environment, but with how the environment plays its role on your trip. And so, tripping in an environment where you're comfy and you're surrounded by people that you trust and you're in a relaxed environment, yes, the trip can get intense, especially with psilocybin, but it's going to come out in a better, more transformative way than if you are under a lot of pressure like I was in this environment. And psilocybin is a very misunderstood drug because although it does have this intensity to it, it has been found recently in clinical trials to help individuals with depression and anxiety of all things. But this is when done in a clinical environment. And obviously, as I've laid out here, this was far from both a relaxed or a clinical environment. So I decided to weigh it out. And I was thinking, okay, I don't want to take a huge, 3-gram trip like I did last time. So I cut it in half. Well, the dose, not the mushrooms. I pulled out a really big mushroom, which on its own weighed 1.5 grams. So that was my dosage for this trip, which I figured is about a moderate dose for just about everybody, and was a lot lighter than the trip I had before, so I was expecting a lesser trip. Little did I know that this was not. And I was already having doubts going into it, so already this should be a red flag. And hopefully, watching this video, you guys understand that, the point I'm trying to get across, that yes, this was a horrible, bad trip that has affected me even now, years after the fact. But this isn't indicative of the substance itself, just its effect on me. Don't take this as a bad trip, you know what I mean? As something that you should never do or never try. That being said, obviously, do your research and stuff. I went over this in the beginning. I keep repeating myself, but it's something that I am a big advocate for the use of psychoactive substances when done properly because of the negative stigma around them. This is why we have the war on drugs and all this other stuff. But I'm going to end this tangent and go back to the trip. So, I was already having hesitancy. I was looking at it, and granted, before you do any substance, especially for the first time in a while, or just the first time in general, even when I did cannabis the first time, even when I do cannabis now from time to time, there's always this initial anxiety, not like an intense anxiety, but kind of like an, okay, am I actually going to do this? But this was more than usual. This was more than the typical, skittishness and nerves before you do a new substance. This was like, I don't know if I should do this, but, by that point I thought I had already pulled it out of the bag. So, there's no point in putting it back. And I threw it in my mouth and I chewed on it and it tasted horrible. And to say, it was nasty. It was the worst tasting thing I'd ever tasted. And I need to preface by saying that the Mexicanas I tasted, because I had heard a lot of trip reports and stories about psilocybin mushrooms tasting like horrible. And I didn't have that problem with the Mexicanas. They actually tasted pretty good. They were almost like meaty, almost like a Salisbury steak kind of flavor, which was nice. I liked that. And I was expecting that this time for some reason, even though it was a different mushroom. But no, this was horrible. And that right then and there already set up my gag reflex. And as you know from psilocybin with dyspraxia, the nausea is a notable part of psilocybin, but also one of the biggest purveyors of both anxiety and the intensity in a psilocybin trip. And already I'm experiencing this because of the taste of the mushrooms. So already I had this nasty taste in my mouth. I did have ginger ale already, but I just didn't think to drink it right away for some reason. I also did have a 52 cup of like fountain Powerade, so that was cool, I guess. You know, that was good for hydration later on, and I'll touch on that later on in the trip. But I didn't even think to drink anything right off the bat. I was like, oh my god, that was horrible. Am I sure I even want to do this? And this is when the kids in the next room started getting louder, and oh man, it was horrible. So I figured I would set the tone. So instead of watching the Joe Rogan Experience right away like I did with the last trip, I decided to watch a music video because I figured I would get myself in the trippy mood by watching something like lo-fi music videos or something. One of my favorite videos when it comes to trippy music videos is Saint Pepsi's Enjoy Yourself, which, I would suggest looking it up on YouTube and going from there. So, it's a nice relaxing song. I like it. And I was thinking, okay, this is going to ease me into the trip. But all of a sudden, I just got this random sting of anxiety as it started to come up. And unlike the last trip, or every other trip I had, it didn't start with visuals like the trips before did. Even cannabis gives me visuals. And that's the whole reason why I enjoy things like psychedelics and stuff, is because it is kind of like an interactive movie. It's like a movie that you're a part of. And the visuals are a large part of that. It's almost like an IMAX movie, or even like a video game, if you will. And I wasn't getting visuals, I just had this sinking feeling of just pure anxiety as the nausea ramped up. And my nose started running like crazy too, which is a notable thing with psychedelics, notably psilocybin for some reason. They do say like runny nose and excessive yawning are things that are common for. The sinking feeling of anxiety just turned into a general feeling of illness. It wasn't even trippy or psychedelic even. I just felt sick. And at that point I was wondering, like, are these actually psilocybin mushrooms? Or did I just consume something that might have killed me? And that's when trips turn scary, is when you start assuming you're going to die. That's probably the worst part of a psychedelic trip. But also when things get transformative, is ego death and all that. But I just started to feel sick. It wasn't even at the dying part even yet. I just felt really sick. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna lay down. And when I went to go lay down, I put on Joe Rogan Experience, thinking, okay, I'll just ride this out with the Joe Rogan Experience like I did with the last one. So I put on the one with him and Paul Stamets. Now, anyone who knows who Paul Stamets is, he's a big mycology guy. So his specialty is mushrooms. So what perfect for a mushroom trip than to listen to Paul Stamets talk? And so I put that on, and it was just background noise because when I closed my eyes, that's when I got visuals. But the visuals were so intense and so colorful. It was so much at once. And the best way I could describe them is anyone who's ever seen the original Monsters, Inc., how in both, I believe it's the opening credits, but especially in the end credits with the colorful doors and the little monsters running in, it was like that, except with a whole bunch of arrows and stuff. And it was syncing with the sound of the podcast, but it was so bright and so intense, and it kept moving in different, ways. And I always considered this unfortunate, looking back on it, because it's one of my favorite things. And had I had not felt sick or had been in such an anxious environment, I would have enjoyed the hell out of that. Like, even now, I wish I could have just experienced the visuals without all the other stuff. Because the visuals were really cool in hindsight. They were really awesome, really intense and really colorful, but really awesome visuals. But that, with the sinking feeling in the back of my mind of, ego death, the thing that kind of goes along with psilocybin trips, especially most tryptamines, where you get the sinking feeling that you're going to die. It's ego death, which is a whole thing in and of itself, and I'm not going to try to go into the whole concept of ego death. There are numerous YouTubers who have done a better job at describing ego death than I ever could. And at first, it wasn't even all that uncomfortable. It was almost comforting thinking I'm going to die, but then I hear the kids in the next room, and I'm thinking, oh God, if I die, all these kids in the next room, they're gonna be like, oh my God, someone died, and all this other stuff, and I'm starting to freak out a little bit. But at the same time, mushrooms are very stoning, and they kind of ground you. It's almost like that couch lock that you get from cannabis, except it's even more intense. It's almost like a sedative. So, I would open my eyes and then I just could barely keep them open, and I would close them again. And when I would close them again, I'd get the super intense visuals. And it was just this constant loop of opening and closing my eyes. And eventually, the podcast ended. Now, Joe Rogan Experience podcasts tend to last about an hour and a half to 2 hours, upwards of 3. And the total of a psilocybin experience can last anywhere from 4 to 6, even as much as 8 if you're on a high enough dose. So I wasn't expecting it to end that soon into the trip. The reason the Joe Rogan Experience thing lasted through my first trip was because I kept stopping it and then clicking on other videos and then going back to it. So then by the time I actually watched and finished the video, it perfectly aligned with the end of the trip. That didn't happen this time. This time the video ended and I had no idea where to go from there. So now, with nothing taking my mind and being in such an intense, absurdly visual, stimulating environment, I turned my lights off and I turned them back on. And I turned them off again and I turned them back on. And no matter how I would modify the area around me, I couldn't get comfortable or grounded or relaxed at all. And this is when I actually started to panic. And panicking when you're on psilocybin mushrooms is not a good thing to do. So that's when I tried to hit up my best friend at the time. And unfortunately, she was actually in the shower getting ready to go to work. So she didn't get back to me right away. Now I'm freaking out. I'm like psycho texting her. And then she had just gotten out of the shower and she messaged me and she's like, you need to lay down. I was like, okay. So I went to go lay down on my bed. And at the time I was sleeping on an air mattress. So I threw myself onto it and it made this loud. And that's why I just felt like I had just died. And it was intense. And then I got back up to look at what she said. And she was like, I don't know what to say, because she had never done any substance, not even like cigarettes. So she had no idea how to help me at all. And she was just trying to like calm me down, tell me to take deep breaths, which is good. And that's the thing is, she's dealt with people who have like serious mental illness. So, that's probably the best way to handle something like someone who's going through a psychedelic crisis like that, is the deep breaths and stuff. And breath work is important when dealing with any sort of anxiety. And obviously, once you relieve the underlying anxiety, the trip will kind of go with it. So I would calm down a little bit, but then I would get like a random thought like, oh, what if those mushrooms were actually poisonous and stuff? And then I would get right back into it again. So eventually she sent her friend, was also a very close friend of mine, to hit me up on Messenger, who had experience with all kinds of trips on psychedelics. And she ended up basically talking me through it. And throughout that whole experience, and I don't even remember much from the rest of it from that point on, except being just in pure misery. And it was just pure hell after that. I would just drift in and out of like near death is what it felt like, but I wouldn't break through because I wouldn't allow myself for some reason. And I mean, that's the big thing when it comes to having a psychedelic trip, especially something like ego death. The best way to go about it is to just let it happen and push through, because psychedelics, for in general, there are some edge cases, but in general, psychedelics are the safest drugs physically out there, and you really won't die from something like a classical psychedelic like psilocybin or LSD. So if you just ride it out, no, you're not going to die. You'll feel like it. You will definitely feel like it, and you may feel like you had died and are now experiencing afterlife. But you aren't actually going to die as long as you stay hydrated and all that. And I mean, she talked me through, and I remember actually finally taking a sip of my Powerade, and it felt like the greatest thing ever, because for some reason I just decided not to drink anything up to that point, and actually rehydrating felt like the greatest experience ever. Um, but throughout the rest of the night, I just felt sick, and I was dry heaving, and I almost vomited, but I don't think I did. And with all the stimulus in the next room and everything, by the time the trip had ended, I didn't feel better. And in both of my mushroom experiences before that, typically the afterglow after a mushroom trip is where you get all the euphoria. You get these feelings of rejuvenation and enlightenment, like everything is good. Like, man, I just overcame this incredible thing, and now I have all this stuff to learn from. It's almost like a pleasurable experience. That's where you get a lot of the euphoria. Like I said, rejuvenation is a really big part of it. That's the big word for it. And I think it's the best word for it because it does feel like being a new person. But I didn't actually experience this until the next morning, because I had come out of it feeling so nauseous and so sick. And physically, I was so drained and wrecked. And I even took a picture afterwards, and I'll put that up here. You can tell in that picture, I just look like a mess. I look wrecked. I look like I just came out of like surgery or something. I was wrecked. And you know, I remember noticing that my pupils were dilated. And for some reason, every time I had ever done any drug, and this is something I'd always seek to see, for some reason, one of the things that appeals to me about these drug experiences is just these small little details that it has on things like the body and brain. Like seeing my pupils dilate is it's just the coolest idea ever. And even with that super intense trip that I had 6 months before, my pupils didn't dilate. I was kind of disappointed. But of course, when I was having a trip where everything was pure hell and agony, that's when my pupils dilated and I didn't really even get to appreciate it. So, yeah, my pupils did dilate this time, but overall, it was a very horrible experience. And honestly, the bulk of how this experience affected me was the aftermath. Because afterwards, well, it wasn't immediately traumatic. In fact, for like a week or two afterwards, I was kind of baseline and nothing would work. And this is one of the weirdest things when it comes to things like psychedelics and stuff, is for like a week or two after that, even weed doesn't seem to get you high. It's almost like you've kind of reached your limit. And so nothing else can really get you to any degree of altered state of consciousness, at least somewhat comparable to that. So yeah, it was just kind of like I was like kind of numb, almost like dead inside, if you will, but not in a bad way. It wasn't until, say, a month or two later that I actually started to experience negative effects, where I just had this random transient anxiety tied to existentialism. And what would happen is I would have just these random existential crises. And the thing is, when you have dyspraxia, and I've talked about this before, and this is part of why I did that video before when I was talking about existentialism and stuff, is with dyspraxia, you tend to just have deep thoughts in general. And you tend to fall into these existential thought patterns. And I remember as a kid, it used to freak the hell out of me, but as an adult, I kind of got used to it. It didn't give me as much anxiety anymore. But for some reason, after this trip, now all of a sudden, even the thought of any existential thought would give me anxiety. And having dyspraxia, being prone to existential thoughts, I would just have these random transient anxiety attacks. Not to the point of panic attacks, at least not at that point, but it was just bad where I would just have random anxiety for seemingly no reason. And this all kind of came to a head when I ended up having to have my appendix removed last year. And when I was recovering, I had like a whole month off from work because I was on a medical leave and stuff. And I just randomly had this like super panic attack, and it was like a damning panic attack, and that's when I noticed it was tied to the psilocybin trip because I was actually starting to have psilocybin visuals, and they weren't like the same visuals as the ones I had experienced in the trip before the last one, but they were just like that. And it was almost like what many would consider HPPD, and it just freaked me out, and I couldn't calm myself down. I ended up having to call a close friend to actually calm me down and everything, and it was traumatizing. And that lasted. I would have these random panic attacks every month for at least 2 or 3 months, and in this time, I was trying. I wanted to upload content, but I just couldn't because I couldn't get the motivation to because I was so anxious all the time. And this is part of why it took me so long to come out and talk about this, is because in that time it was just I didn't even know if I wanted to talk about it because I didn't want anyone thinking I was going crazy or had gone nuts or had a mental break, because although I had like a crazy panic attack, I still wouldn't consider it having a mental break. And I also didn't want to create some kind of idea that mushrooms were bad or that this was the fault of the mushrooms either. And this is why I wanted to wait until now when I had all this introspection, and I'm obviously in a better place now mentally and physically and just in general to do this video. Now, eventually, obviously, I did recover for the most part, and I've since been pretty good. I don't really have anxiety as much anymore, especially because like a month ago, I just quit my job, which has been probably the most rewarding experience I've had probably ever, because I feel so free and relaxed now. And just in general, I have made a full recovery. So even if you are, say, watching this video and you have gone through a similar experience, just know you'll probably get out of it. You're fine. It's all right. It'll last a little bit, and I've even read a few trip reports and things on the R Shrooms Reddit where people have discussed having experiences like this as well. Where, yeah, it can last up to a couple of months, where it's just you're going to have this anxiety and fear and stuff, but you will get over it, and I did. And since then, a lot's changed in my perspective on doing drugs as flippantly as I have before. I since haven't really consumed cannabis all that much either. And part of that is because ever since that trip, for some reason, cannabis just gives me anxiety now. And I mean, I've had bad cannabis experiences before. I've talked about this in Cannabis with Dyspraxia, but never to such a common occurrence as now. Where now, if I even consume just the slightest bit more cannabis, it's almost like having a bad trip again. So I'm at the point where I can't even consume cannabis anymore. I've also since decided to just never do any drug really again. I would quit smoking if I could, because nicotine is a drug. But thankfully, despite my addiction, nicotine isn't a drug that creates heavy visuals, so it's something I can comfortably do. And despite my addiction, it's not going to have as negative an effect on my day to day life. Now, obviously, there's the risk of COPD, emphysema, and all that other stuff. So, yeah, I want to try to cut back. And I have tried quitting to varying levels of success for the past year or so. But overall, yeah, it's changed my perspective on me taking drugs. And I definitely will probably never do another psychedelic again. And because of the lasting anxiety and everything, it's really hard to make a video anymore, because I really wanted to address this and get the elephant out of the room. Because it's a large reason why a lot of my more recent videos are more existentialist and intense and rambly in a magical thinking kind of way. But it was something that was on my chest that I really wanted to get off. And it was hard to actually make a video without kind of bringing it up or talking about it. So, I didn't really want to address it in my videos for so long. And now I've finally decided, it's time to do it. And part of that is because I found out that I have psychoactive mushrooms growing in my backyard. Not intentionally, mind you, but there is a very common psychedelic mushroom that grows natively all over the world. And it just kind of made me think about it. And I was like, you know what? I think it's been enough time that I can talk about this comfortably and do a video about it. And I've had a lot of support from you guys over the past couple of years. I'm surprised in the last year, despite having uploaded significantly less content than I did in previous years, I've got more subscribers than ever before, which is incredible, and I appreciate all your support. So at least I know that this video isn't going to fall on deaf ears. I do feel bad because I know a majority of you guys follow my content for dyspraxia, and I will go back to dyspraxia related content after this. Hopefully, being out of work now, I'll have more time to do dyspraxia content as well. But this was something I really needed to come to terms with and do a video about. And having finally recorded this video and come to terms with it and acknowledged it on this public forum now, I actually feel a lot more enlightened and a lot better. And it feels good to finally, put this aside and put it out there and get it off my chest. And for anyone who wants a more detailed idea of my trip, anyone who's followed my channel recently has probably seen my video, All Hail the Mushroom Gods. That song was literally based off of that trip. So when it comes to making music and stuff, I never plan anything. Music has always been more of a hobby to me than anything. So even when I do live shows or record albums or whatever, I don't practice the songs ahead of time. I just play. I'll either, have some pre-recorded drum tracks, or I'll just grab a random drummer, say, "Hey, you want to play drums for me? All right, hop on the drums. Let's go and jam." And whatever happens, happens. And for some reason, it always comes out pretty good. You guys seem to like it, so that's what happened. And I was standing there. It was like my birthday. I didn't know what to play because I was just playing with Kenny Allentown of this local band who I was really good friends with. It's really cool. So I didn't really want to upstage that because I actually did have a planned song I was gonna do with them. So I just went with whatever was on my mind, and immediately I thought of mushrooms. And I was like, you know what? This has been on my mind forever. I'm going to get it off my chest right here in the open. And so that kind of happened, and everyone liked it. Even most of my friends really like that. And eventually, when I do release that album on a more public release, I look forward to seeing how people receive it, because people really seem to have liked All Hail the Mushroom Gods. So yeah, that's where that song came from too, was this specific mushroom trip. So if you guys like that song, here's the basis for it. But yeah, that's it for this one, everyone. It feels really good to have gotten that off my chest. Hopefully the editing and everything of this will go smoothly so I can upload it as soon as possible. Get you guys updated, because I know I haven't made content in like a month now. And the last one was a follow-up episode, and I know follow-up episodes aren't the most well-received content. I really hope this is, and I kind of feel bad for all my fellow dyspraxics, who want more dyspraxia content. I do plan on doing more now. But this is something that's been eating away at me for a while, and I really needed to get it off my chest on this forum. So thanks, guys. Y'all are awesome. We're now 230 something strong. So that's all for this one, everyone. You guys have a good one.